Yeah, so I'll start by saying that it is kind of restrictive to think of catalytic capital or early stage capital as only as VC like capital or early stage equity. At IFC, we've had the experience of using a very wide range of instruments to address a variety of challenges and investment barriers across a wide variety of sectors. Having with that background in mind, I would say the sources of catalytic capital today are OECD governments, which have made international commitments at frameworks like the COP and similar events. Increasingly, some philanthropies and foundations which are interested in investing their money on concessional terms in particular niches of projects which require concessional capital. And then there is the odd situation where a particular government in an emerging market has some capital and they don't know what exactly to do with it and how best to deploy it to meet their objectives. So I would say these are the main sources of catalytic capital within the arena of climate change. Yeah, so the sectors that require blended finance within the ambit of climate is a fairly large canvas. And I would preface that by saying that our experience as a development financial institution is the same sector in a particular country requires a completely different type of blended finance instrument or intervention to make it attractive to private sector investors, given the maturity of the market, the enabling regulations, and obviously the macroeconomic conditions. So, sectors which IFC has provided blended finance to under the aegis of climate change include obviously renewable energies and then renewable energy technologies which are emerging as we make progress with new types of renewable energy generation, climate smart agriculture, uh, waste management in various forms ranging from landfills to plants that use waste and generate power, uh, forestry and reforestation projects of different types, and lastly, green buildings, and with a particular focus for us being the affordable segment of green buildings. So, as you can see, climate change sectors span a very wide spectrum of the economy, and often there are strong interlinkages between climate change and other related development issues like poverty alleviation, food security, etc. So, to us, climate change is one of the central themes that we are looking to address through various types of blended finance. Today, we live in a world where most youngsters and teens know the names of prominent central bankers, and that used to not be the case when I was a teenager. So, what has happened in the last 15, 20 years is that the world is flush with liquidity and capital thanks to the actions of particular central banks, and we live in a world where banks and shadow banks are constantly looking to optimize risk adjusted return on the capital that they have. So in that context, when a government is looking at a particular sector and why it is, say, not succeeding or not attracting the kind of capital that they want to, I think a critical step is to then first accept that there is some gap in either the regulation that leads to a perception of risk, whether that is actual risk or perceived risk is a second order question, but that leads to a perception of risk and that keeps investors away from investing in that sector. And I say this with a lot of emphasis because there is so much liquidity in the world today that is probably the best starting point for a government to think about why there isn't investment in a particular sector, and particularly for climate where there are strong commitments by various players, development banks, and increasingly private capital, that would be a very good starting point to introspect and understand why there is no flow of capital to a particular sector under climate. The blended finance world involves development finance institutions and then increasingly banks who have access to these kind of resources. And one of the key challenges from the lens of a bank is not to employ these resources in a race to the bottom. And that in turn entails establishing a framework for looking at these blended finance projects where blended finance investments are provided. And then uh, at IFC, we have set up a very uh, strict governance mechanism where we are required to get approval for our blended finance investments through a separate committee of senior committee of VPs working at IFC, and we have a separate team looking at each blended finance project. The role of the team is to determine the most suitable instrument that would address a particular uh, market barrier or challenge that prevents the project from happening, and then providing uh, just enough concessionality to make the project happen without creating market distortions. And in doing so, the emphasis is on making subsequent projects in the same sector get access to financing on easier terms or better terms after this particular project has succeeded. From the lens of a contributor, I would say the key challenge is to recognize that different types of projects require different instruments, which in turn require different tolerance in risk tolerance. In the past few years, we have moved to a scenario where many contributors actually expect return of their principal, which entails that there is a limited amount of risk that capital can bear. And yet many contributors believe that there is no direct linkage between the risk that their capital can bear and the amount of leverage, that is the crowding in, that can take place from such capital. And I think from the eyes of a contributor, it's important to provide a flexible enough toolkit that allows the user of the blended finance instruments to invest the money in a way where it makes sense to address the challenge at hand and results in a commercially successful project. And the commercial success of the project is actually quite important, because that is one of the things that can attract and crowd in more capital in the theme of catalytic instruments that we started the chat with. Yes, so my answer would be projects are utilizing blended finance solutions in all economies, even though they may not be explicitly called blended finance. And an example I would give would be the recent Inflation Reduction Act in the United States, which provides incentives to a large swaths of the economy with a particular focus of accelerating a green transition and creating an economy which goes in the direction of achieving net zero over a sustained period. Similarly, we have seen that when we are providing blended finance across different countries, the solutions that are required in, say, investment grade countries such as Morocco or a Philippines or Indonesia would be very different from the blended finance de-risking solutions that are needed in low income countries or fragile countries. And for us, it is key to recognize that, again, while the main bulk of the climate or the GHG emissions is from large middle income countries, the impacts of climate change are felt by all countries, and therefore we need to come up with solutions that make sense both for large middle income countries as well as small fragile affected and low income countries. So in that to that end, I would say yes, all countries do need and are using blended finance solutions in different forms and shape. And I would again say that it would not be a good idea to have a one size fits all approach, given the variety of sectors, countries, and challenges that different subsectors within the climate arena. Yes, and so when governments are trying to use their own funds to uh, crowd in investments into a particular sector, one starting point would be to insist on transparency, on how the blended finance is used and how different projects within the sector are benchmarked in terms of the subsidy that they needed to get off the ground. Transparency in this manner ensures that the recipients of the blended finance, let's say private sector developers, use it in a manner that is disciplined and that they think of ways to channel the subsidies to the ultimate beneficiaries or end users. So, for a water project, that would be retail and bulk consumers that are receiving water from a water treatment plant. So, that would be step number one is to ensure transparency as in the use of blended finance. Step number two would be in the area of public private partnerships, where usually what happens is bidders are invited to, as part of a bid process, to bid on a power project or a water project or a desalination project. And there, I think the key to realize is that the government should not venture in the direction of maximizing risk allocations to the private sector developer, but rather retain some of the risks which are best handled by the public sector and thereby stay committed to the sector. And an added requirement would be to ensure that there are supporting regulations which are constant or consistent over time to ensure that investors feel comfortable in providing long tenor capital and are able to again make risk adjusted returns from these projects which haven't happened before. And the last step I would say for the governments is to uh, interact with capital providers. As I said, today we live in a very liquid world and actually get feedback from them on what is working and what is not, and be ready to course correct and in certain areas where no investments are coming in at all, despite say policy statements requiring or expecting investments in a particular area. So the strategic use of this kind of funding would be to meet the commitments that have been made by various governments as part of the Paris Accord. Governments have signed up to a, a net zero economy, which would require obviously many decades. And there is a particular trajectory that they have in mind to get to that net zero economy. This would entail orchestrating investments into sectors which today do not are not commercial, and then using blended finance to improve the commercial viability of these sectors. And as the sectors establish a track record and become commercially viable and therefore do not need blended finance from that point onwards, is to then redirect the blended finance in more difficult sectors which today would be non-starters. So different countries would have different strategic uses of the blended finance to meet the targets that they have set for themselves. And again, a key attribute of this needs to be a good understanding of the risk adjusted returns that investors expect and the regulatory framework that investors expect to invest in a particular country. I believe there is a great deal of learning to be had from the experiences of other countries where these kind of projects have succeeded, and to use that as a starting block to then craft policies and regulations which become suitable for the country in question or the government in question that is looking to attract investments into a particular sector. in order to address the perception of risk in a sector, I think the first step is to have some kind of diagnostic, whether it's done by a development bank or a consulting firm, on what are the best practices that are working in other countries in that particular sector. For example, let's take the sector of green buildings, where the key challenge in making investments in the area of affordable green housing is the fact that home buyers cannot afford a home if it has significantly higher cost due to green design features. And on the supply side, developers don't want to develop homes with green features if they think that there is no market for them. And then in such a situation, you need interventions both on the supply and the demand side simultaneously to unlock the market and then create a market for, say, affordable green housing. And so, if a particular country is looking to attract private capital in the area of affordable green housing, a good step would be to look at countries which have succeeded in doing so and what were their starting conditions, and then what helped them unlock investments into that particular sector. So, in today's hyper-connected world, that is a relatively simple exercise once you have put your mind to it and have the necessary resources to focus in on the problem. So I think one example where blended finance was key to kickstart a particular sector and is no longer needed in many countries is the area of solar power generation, or solar IPPs, independent power producing companies. And there, what happened, I would say, a decade ago was many governments decided that they would look to solar as an important source of power within their grid. They started approaching developers through a bid process, and as part of that bid, many development banks provided concessional loans to all bidders, who then were able to bid lower tariffs. And this started a process where successive rounds of bids needed lower and lower levels of blended finance, until we reached a stage in many countries where actually today solar power is competitive on its own, and there is no further justification or need for blended finance for plain vanilla solar IPPs, especially in the middle income countries where there is good solar resources. And that is the prime example of a sector where blended finance was absolutely needed to kickstart the sector, and today it has completely graduated from the justifiable use of blended finance in that particular sector.